Oh, this is King Rex coming at you with another reaction video. This is a reaction to Mr. Beats' Every President's Biggest Mistake. I'm probably going to cut this into a two-parter because this video is almost 40 minutes long, and these reaction video usually takes twice as long as the original content. I did this Every President's Biggest Best Thing they did, so this is kind of the reverse of that. I'm just going to get started with the video right now.
Mr. Beat, you got a problem with that, huh? Step up if you got a problem with that. Come on, let's go. I'm sorry, I'm just in a bad mood after researching for this video. It's got me all negative, cynical, paranoid. You see, this video is about mistakes. Look, all human beings make mistakes. No one is perfect. This is why everyone should be canceled.
I actually think that's a pretty good joke there, that everyone should be canceled, because there's a lot of cancel culture stuff going on out there. And he's literally correct. I mean, everyone in their life has made some type of mistake. If you really went through everything everyone did, you probably could find a reason not to like them. So, I think, a good joke. The whole intro is a good kind of a joke too. Like he's acting like he's ready to just fight with somebody because he's in a bad mood. And it does give some personality to the video. So I like this intro so far.
Anyway, American presidents are not immune to this. This video is about the greatest mistake of every American president while they were in office. Their worst failure. Their biggest oopsie.
Also want to note, it says while they were in office, so you can't go off of something they did while they were not in office, which I do like that standard. I think that is the standard that Matt does use for all of his president's videos, is while they were in office. So I do give him kudos for that. I like the standard.
You get it. When I say greatest mistake, I mean the one thing they did that hurt the most people. And when I say thing they did that hurt the most people, I say it with my historian hat on, looking at all of American history.
He says it with his historian hat on. We'll keep an eye out on that because I do know that Mr. Beats sometimes lets his political views creep in, so we'll keep an eye out on that too. So with your historian hat on, you have to look at how it basically the historical effects of it, not whether you like a certain type of policy or not.
So I guess recent presidents have the advantage of all of us not knowing the full extent of damage they truly have done.
That does make sense to say because we don't know. Like, I mean, if it's less than 20 years since they left office, you generally don't know. So I probably will not be doing the last few presidents on here. I think each one of these is a president. Like you can see, like that's Biden. That's a pretty long thing for Biden or Trump. So I'll probably stop at Clinton, honestly, because you really can't know the full effects. Because I mean, there's even things that sometimes the effects are decades, not more than just 20 years down the road.
Okay, let's do this. George Washington. Even my favorite president wasn't perfect. The biggest flaw in his presidency was his failure to use his influence to call for an end to slavery.
This one I don't think was within the realm of possibility. Washington's presidency was all about holding the nation together and, making the Constitution work. If you would have tried to end slavery, it would have never worked because at least 2 or 3 southern states would have left. And a civil war at that time between slave states and free states probably wouldn't have worked. Plus, even a lot of states that are now considered free states had some form of slavery in them. Massachusetts is the only state I believe that was completely slave-free at the time. I'm almost positive that New York had its eventual emancipation laws on the books. But to give you an idea, James Buchanan actually owned slaves as an adult under that law. And there was actually slaves in New Jersey, which had eventual emancipation, that were freed by the 13th Amendment. But even saying that the normal Mason-Dixon line, which is Pennsylvania and Maryland, if it would have divided the country, the South probably would have been able to make itself its own country. Remember that slavery was more important to Maryland and Virginia at the time than it was during the Civil War, because they actually they were actually the big slave states at the time that had the most slaves because you didn't have the cotton belt part going on that you did later because this was before the cotton gin. So Washington could not have done this. I'd say his biggest mistake was probably the Fugitive Slave Act, even though it's called for in the Constitution that the fugitive slaves have to be returned. They don't say fugitive slaves. I think they say something like persons held in service or something, but it is in the Constitution. I still think that that was probably his biggest mistake because he really didn't make any big mistakes, and that was probably the worst thing he did. But it's something he was kind of required to do under the Constitution. So to me, I mean, I probably could nitpick a decision like Jefferson was not a very good Secretary of State. So picking him as Secretary of State might have actually been his biggest mistake because Jefferson didn't work against Washington's administration as Secretary of State.
By the time he was president, he had long privately said that slavery was bad and needed to go away, but his worry of his own financial security prevented him from freeing his own slaves.
This is actually not 100% true. Most of the founding fathers that you think of actually wanted to get rid of slavery. The general population probably wouldn't have. But the people that were the founders, like Washington, Jefferson, Madison, even though they owned slaves, they did want to get rid of it, and they actually didn't like that slavery existed. The two states that really fought to have slavery included were South Carolina and Georgia. But I think if those two states would have seceded, I think you might have had like North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware going with them, which would have been really weird if Virginia would have seceded from the United States when Washington was president of the United States because Washington was from Virginia. But I think you might have had a rebellion on your hand if you tried to do that. So I don't think you could have. And actually, Washington would not sell a slave without their permission. And he actually lost money keeping some slaves when he should have sold them. And he also wouldn't free one that was to the age where they couldn't, no longer provide for themselves. Because you could take, like, say there was a guy that was 50 years old that couldn't work anymore. He would keep them. There were some cases where slave owners would free the ones that were no longer useful if they were handicapped in some manner, which Washington didn't do that. I'm not defending slavery. Slavery is a bad thing, but you have to also remember when Washington was president, every country in the world allowed for slavery. The first country to outlaw slavery was Haiti in 1804 when it was created from a slave revolt, which was after Washington died.
Imagine if such a unifying figure as Washington went public about him being against slavery and freeing all his slaves while president.
If he would have done that, he would have alienated the South. He wouldn't have been so universally well liked. It can turn quickly. I mean, Herbert Hoover at one point was a universally well-liked figure until the Great Depression hit.
The country would have been so much better off in the following decades. John Adams. Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, 4 of the worst laws in American history.
I halfway agree with Matt here. The Sedition Act was one of the worst laws in American history, but the Alien Acts really weren't as bad as they're made out to be. The Naturalization Act just increased the amount of years it took to become a U.S. citizen. It was 5. It moved it to 12. I think right now it's somewhere between 7 and 10 years. That's basically a preference. I think 5 is too short and 12 is too long. 7 to 10 years is probably a reasonable amount of time, but really 5 and 12 aren't totally unreasonable. The other Alien Acts basically allowed the president to deport people that were enemies of the country. Basically, if someone was doing something that was undermining the country, they could deport them if they weren't a U.S. citizen. And the other one allowed them to deport people that were citizens of a country which the country was at war with. I think those are reasonable, especially national defense policies. You have to remember, the United States wasn't the juggernaut militarily that it is today. So having a whole bunch of people in your country from another country you're at war with could possibly be bad. So the Sedition Act was really bad. He didn't overly abuse it, but it was abused because he did arrest people for basically voicing displeasure with the government or anyone in the government other than Thomas Jefferson. For some reason, the office of vice president was left out of this act. And you could say negative stuff about the vice president, but not the president and other members of the government.
The Naturalization Act made it harder to become a citizen. The Alien Friends Act allowed the president to easily imprison or deport any foreigner who they thought was dangerous. The Alien Enemies Act gave the president even more powers to detain foreigners during a war. And the Sedition Act, which was the worst of them all in my opinion, made it illegal to talk trash or make up fake news about the federal government. I hope you realize the Sedition Act spit all over the First Amendment.
I agree with him on the Sedition Act 100%, which is, it's a long way as to why I personally put John Adams as one of the bottom 10 presidents based solely on his president because of the Sedition Act and a few other mistakes he made, like mishandling the XYZ affair, which you literally could say was the biggest issue because his mishandling of the XYZ affair caused him to pass the Alien Sedition Acts, caused him to pass the direct tax, which was another bad policy he had, and it caused the quasi-war with France, which was another bad thing. So you could actually argue that the mishandling of the XYZ affair was worse because it actually caused all these other things. But I could see saying the Sedition Act is the one worst individual thing because it was the worst of all the things that came out of the bad handling of the XYZ affair.
Thomas Jefferson. First of all, Jefferson, of course, was even worse than George Washington when it came to slavery. Sure, for most of his life, he called for it to eventually end, and he did sign a law to ban the importation of slaves while president, but he likely fathered multiple enslaved children with one of his young slaves.
This has really nothing to do with, other than him outlawing the importation of slaves, nothing to do with his presidency. We know that descendants of Sally Hemings are somehow related to Thomas Jefferson. We don't know if Thomas Jefferson fathered those descendants or the grandparents of those descendants or someone else in the Jefferson family. And I know the rumor was that he did, but there was a lot of made-up vicious rumors at the times as political attacks because they generally attacked politicians on personal basis back in the early 1800s, 1700s, early 1800s when there were elections. They really didn't attack on policy. I mean, I think John Quincy Adams was accused of, making American citizens prostitutes for the Russian Tsar, things like that. So the attacks you really have to take with a grain of salt.
And owned more slaves than any other president in American history, and he didn't free almost all of them. Ugh, Jefferson. But, that all aside, I think his biggest mistake while he was president was signing the Embargo Act of 1807. It banned pretty much all trade with Britain and France. Jefferson
Actually, the Embargo Act banned all trade with all foreign countries, not just Britain and France. The Non-Intercourse Act, which replaced the Embargo Act, banned it with Britain and France. And it probably was one of the dumbest laws ever passed, quite frankly, because it actually triggered a recession and there was some very draconian enforcement of the law. So it was really bad. The thing that Jefferson did that would have been the worst had he succeeded in doing it, or succeeded in doing it, I pronounced that wrong, would have been his attack on the federal judiciary when he tried to impeach Supreme Court justices because he disagreed with their politics. But he failed in that endeavor, so it would be the Embargo Act.
Supported the law in order to avoid war with both countries, but it ended up devastating the American economy. The country lost tens of millions of dollars and tens of thousands of jobs.
It was also kind of did inflame things leading up to the War of 1812.
James Madison. In my video about every president's greatest accomplishment, I said Madison's biggest achievement was holding Britain back during the War of 1812. Ironically, though, I think his biggest mistake was failing to prevent that war from happening in the first place. They called it, quote, Mr. Madison's War, for good reason. After all, he convinced a divided Congress to move forward with declaring war on a much more powerful country that could easily defeat them if it really wanted to. It was reckless, to say the least.
I somewhat disagree just because I believe that the way things were going, the war almost had to happen. Britain was stopping U.S. ships, not allowing them to trade with any country on the continent of Europe. Britain was basically kidnapping U.S. sailors and then basically making them slaves on their own ships with impressment. They failed to vacate the forts that were part of the Treaty of Paris that gave the United States basically it's most of its territory east of the Mississippi, everything but like Florida and like the panhandle down there of the Alabama and Mississippi and part of Louisiana. Um, so, and they were inciting Indians and creating Indian revolts because they wanted what became the Midwestern states to become a buffer Indian state at the time. So they basically, Britain was basically causing all these issues. I'd say his biggest mistake probably was not rechartering the National Bank in 1811 because it caused a lot of issues, especially in paying for the war. And they did have to eventually recharter it in 1816, and it did end up leading to bad economic times because when there was no federal bank, which the first bank actually had stopgaps so you wouldn't have crazy inflation, when they didn't have that, the state bank stepped in and it caused a lot of inflation that had to be reined back in and eventually led to a recession. So I would say not rechartering the bank. I think he had to go to war with England just because of what was going on, or England would have continued to push the United States around.
James Monroe. Monroe's biggest mistake was signing the Missouri Compromise. I used to be more indifferent about the law, but after learning more about it, I can more confidently now say it was a major cause of the Civil War. The Missouri Compromise admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state to maintain the equal balance of slave states and free states that had already existed. It also prohibited slavery north of a line of latitude west of the southern border of Missouri, despite the fact that Monroe had expressed several times that he wanted slavery eventually abolished. This law, in fact, made the institution more permanent. Sure, it avoided a national crisis, but it only kicked the can down the road. The crisis.
It's kind of hard to disagree with him because he probably is correct. But the thing is first off, the map he has there is not the correct map because there were other states south of Missouri that were created after the Missouri Compromise. But the idea of the compromise was, first off, slavery already existed in Missouri at the time. If Missouri wasn't, so basically what he did was he allowed Missouri to become a state, which really should have happened under the Constitution. And the state of Maine was actually kind of a ruse because they made Maine a state, but Maine had already been part of Massachusetts. So they made a free state by splitting one into two. Now, the issue of the Missouri Compromise is it did kind of further push the line north and south but most of those states that were north of that line either were already formed of slavery or they prohibited it anyway. But I guess you could have theoretically had slavery in a state like Iowa or Minnesota that wasn't a state yet at the time. So it did kind of do that north-south divide a little bit more. And the Missouri Compromise only applied to the Louisiana Territory. So it did not apply to the territories that were added by the Mexican Cession, which happened under Polk when he took territory from Mexico. I think the American War was more of a catalyst for the Civil War than this law. It did push the problem down the road, but if it hadn't been for the introduction of new territory after the fact, it probably would have solved the issue. But yeah, it did kind of more or less cement that divide north and south, although you could say the Northwest Ordinance that didn't allow slavery in what became the Midwest, which is Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan, probably also did that by prohibiting it in certain northern states.
Crisis would only get worse later on, and Monroe could have prevented it.
It should also be noted that like every president from Washington right up through, I'd say Fillmore kind of kicked the can down the road on this. Even Polk, who brought in the territory from the Mexican Cession, never actually had a way of how to deal. They never said, should the Missouri Compromise be extended to the Pacific Ocean beforehand, which he actually did want. He rejected the Wilmot Proviso, which would not have allowed slavery in those new territories. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act was what really reopened it because that was allowing slavery in territory that had already previously been barred, and that was areas that were not allowed to have slavery under the Missouri Compromise. So I'd say Kansas-Nebraska Act was probably the point of no return for the Civil War. I do believe that it did kind of ingrain the North-South a little bit. It probably, for that reason, might have been the worst thing he did. But he's one of those presidents like Washington where he really didn't do nothing that was all that bad.
John Quincy Adams. You all know me. I'm still the same old teach. I hate tariffs because they make stuff more expensive for you and me.
This is him being political. Tariffs do make things more expensive by raising the price of goods, but the government's going to collect taxes somehow, and any tax the government collects is going to cost you buying power. Income taxes and payroll taxes do the same thing. They cost you buying power. You're just doing it in a different way by taking your money before you spend it, where tariffs just add costs on the products you buy, the same way as excise taxes, which are like on gas and alcohol, or even sales tax, or even if they did a value-added tax. And then property taxes items that you own, which is usually actual physical property like a house. So all taxes lower your buying power. So picking on just one tax type, tariffs, because of that, is really not a good way to look at it. And this is also him being political, where he said he was going to use his historian hat. This is him taking his historian hat off when he's going after a tariff individually. So this is a case where he's actually going against something he said at the beginning. Plus, if you look at the tariffs in a certain way, they actually do help American companies exist, which provide more jobs. So they actually at least have a good benefit to them. None of these other taxes have a good benefit. You can argue that the things they use the tax dollars for have a good benefit, but an income tax doesn't have a good benefit inherent in it. A sales tax doesn't have a good benefit inherent in it. A tariff actually does because it helps American manufacturing and helps to create American jobs.
As it turns out, JQ's biggest mistake was signing the Tariff of 1828, or as I and other critics like to call it, the Tariff of Abominations. It hurt both industry and farming alike.
Actually, it did not hurt industry and farming alike. In fact, under the tariff of 1828, the economy was actually really good. If you actually look at tariffs in the long run of U.S. history before the outbreak of the Great Depression, the times with higher tariffs tended to have better economy. The times with lower tariffs tended to have worse. The compromise tariff of 1833 was on during the Panic of 1837. There was actually a smaller recession before that, and from 1833 to 1834, then you had the Panic. So you actually had a small recession. It got better for a little tiny bit. Then you had another recession hit. So also the Panic of 1857 had the Walker Tariff right before it. The Wilson-Gorman was during the Panic of 1893. The Depression of 1920, 1921 was the Underwood Tariff. So the lower tariffs tended to be the time frame where the economy was bad, especially if you're going especially if you're going from this tariff on or even the tariff before. So you generally have a bad. So really, passing this tariff didn't hurt business. It did cause the nullification crisis, but that was really more or less the problem with that is that the South caused it because Southern leaders like John Calhoun actually made sure that the tariff would be written in the way it was, hoping that it was so bad that it would be rejected in the New England states so they could blame the National Republicans, which ended up becoming the Whigs, for the failure of the tariff because it was popular in the Mid-Atlantic states, and the Democrats needed to be at least competitive in the Mid-Atlantic states to win the national elections.
It even led to the nullification crisis. Andrew Jackson. Of course, his signing of the Indian Removal Act and causing the Trail of Tears was horrible, but I think Jackson's ill-informed, hard money policies ultimately hurt even more people. He refused to establish a new Bank of the United States, instead allowing state banks to just freely loan paper money to pretty much anyone who asked for it.
That's the thing. Hard money would not be this inflationary money practice.
In response to this crisis, Jackson issued an executive order that required all payment for federal government land to be paid for in either gold or silver. Well, this caused inflation to soar. Eventually, this all...
Actually, he's got that wrong. The Specky Circular did not cause inflation to soar. The pet banks, Jackson basically did was he started a bank war where he had his Secretary of Treasury illegally remove the deposits, the U.S. government deposits from the second bank in the United States of America. He should have been impeached for it because it was an illegal act. Which my choice for Jackson would be basically all the illegal impeachable offenses that he was a lawless president. That would be his biggest mistake. When that money was removed, it was put in pet banks that supported Jackson politically. Those banks printed all kinds of extra currency, which led to the inflation. Because inflation was starting to become a problem, and in fact, I think it's caused foreign governments like Britain to pull back investment within the United States because the economy was going sour. He did the Specky Circular, which basically crashed the economy into a recession, and which is where you got the recession that happened before the Panic of 1837. Then you had another recession with the Panic of 1837. Basically, his actions in the Compromise Tariff of 1833, the Bank War, and the Specky Circular all caused these issues. So it wasn't that he had hard money, like Mr. Beat's getting it economically backwards. It wasn't hard money when it was the pet banks. That was soft money. That caused the inflation. And the hard money was the Specky Circular. But that pretty much just threw the economy into a tailspin. Because now all this inflated currency became really worthless when he did that. Because the government would not accept paper currency, they would accept gold. So then the paper currency kind of lost its value and caused runs on the banks because people wanted their gold. And there was not enough gold to back the paper currency.
Well, at least partially led to the Panic of 1837.
Jackson outright caused the Panic of 1837. It didn't partially lead to. He's the president that's probably most responsible for an economic recession in the history of the country. Once again, it's his lawlessness that I put first. Illegally removing deposits from the bank. As far as the Trail of Tears goes, he actually disobeyed a Supreme Court order. He allowed his Postmaster General to destroy anti-slavery mailings, which is they were basically like newspapers that were sent to people in the South that was trying to convince them to get rid of their slaves. So it goes against freedom of press, basically. And he actually pushed for the gag rule in Congress, which wouldn't allow anti-slavery petitions in the House of Representatives, which goes against freedom of speech. His lawlessness was his biggest mistake, and it was throughout his entire presidency. He's so bad that you can't just pick one.
And one of the worst depressions in American history. Normally, the president doesn't have much control over the economy, but Jackson's actions certainly played a big role causing this economic crisis.
Actually, presidents do have a lot of control over the economy. It's just you don't see it immediately. If something happens underneath the president and it immediately changes, like right as they become president, it probably wasn't their fault that there was a downturn. Now, how they respond to that can make it better or worse. And most of the bad panics, like the Panic of 1837, Panic of 1857, Panic of 1893, and the Great Depression, because they changed the name, really were made worse by bad actions of the presidents at that time.
Martin Van Buren. So what was the Trail of Tears? Well, it was a series of forced displacements of around 60,000 people from the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations. They were forced out of their homes in the southeast and marched out west for thousands of miles. Most ended up in future Oklahoma. The relocated suffered from disease and starvation on the way, traveling often through harsh conditions. Andrew Jackson may have signed the Indian Removal Act and started the Trail of Tears, but it was Van Buren who carried out the most infamous part of the Trail of Tears, the removal of the Cherokee from Georgia. At least 4,000 of them died, many of them babies or small children, as they traveled on foot through a particularly harsh winter, most with no shoes on and little clothing.
I agree with that one, but it should be pointed out Jackson was more guilty. I think the first three tribes were removed under Jackson, but the Cherokee is the one that generally gets the most press or most focus. But I'd go at least 60-40 with Jackson getting 60% of the blame for that one, but I do agree that was the worst thing Van Buren did. Van Buren just didn't do anything good as president. It was one of his biggest issues. And he was the first Northern president that was actively pro-slavery.
William Henry Harrison. Yeah, Harrison's biggest mistake while president was drinking the D.C. water. That's apparently what got him sick and led to his death just a month into his presidency.
Yeah, I agree with this. Not only did Harrison die from bad sanitary conditions in Washington, it's pretty much been proven that that's almost 99% sure the reason why Zachary Taylor died. Polk died not long after leaving Washington, and Polk was a younger president. He was actually, I think, 49 when he became president. And there were other people in Washington that died that were famous. I don't know all the names. So basically, yeah, I guess you could argue that trusting the water in Washington D.C., which I guess that's the worst thing he could have done, but he's only president for a month, so he really didn't get a chance to be president.
John Tyler. Believe it or not, Tyler didn't make many mistakes as president. Then again, he didn't accomplish much as president either.
I disagree with that statement. He got the Webster-Ashburn Treaty signed, which was a big accomplishment he made. He had a trade treaty with China. He stood up for and held for Hawaii's independence as a country. He ended the Second Seminole War. He signed a new tariff, I think, in 1843. He annexed Texas as president. So he actually did do quite a few things as president. He has a lot of accomplishments. This kind of leads me to believe that Mr. Beat doesn't know much more than what you get out of a college history book about presidents. I would actually recommend he learn something about John Tyler because he did a lot as president.
I think his biggest mistake was refusing to reestablish a national bank. He even vetoed a bill to charter one, while central banks have...
He vetoed the first national bank, and he gave reservations as to why he vetoed it. Then they went and made another bank bill that answered all those reservations, and he vetoed the second bank bill. So yes, I do agree that his biggest mistake was in basically causing himself to be alienated from his party. He should have worked with him to get what he thought was a workable bill. You kind of do need a unified currency. When you have a unified currency, you have different banks for all out there in the country making different currency, and it has different value depending on where you're at. It's not like today where you have a bank like, say, Key Bank or Bank of America that's across several states. It usually was Pennsylvania had a bank, maybe more than one, New York, Virginia. And then if you had a note from a bank in Massachusetts, it would hold the same value in Maryland as a note from Pennsylvania would, because you had to go a lot further to cash that note in for gold. So he should have. So I agree with this. This was probably his biggest mistake. But he actually did do quite a bit as president.
Not always made things completely all rosy throughout history. Most economists argue that they have kept markets stable and helped prevent economic crashes. In fact, that aforementioned Panic of 1837 likely would have been avoided if there had been a central bank in place to regulate banking transactions.
It should be noted, though, that central banks can cause crashes, too. The stock market crash that caused the start of the Great Depression was caused by the Federal Reserve having bad monetary policies. The Federal Reserve also caused the recession of 1957 as well. So the banks can mess up too, but having a unified currency is a good thing, which is why you should have a national bank. It's just you do need some of the problems with the system we have right now. They cause a lot of the business cycle.
And help failing banks. After Tyler vetoed the national bank, it wouldn't come back for a while, and for the rest of the century, the country experienced some of its worst bank runs and recessions ever. James Polk. Polk's biggest mistake was starting an unjust war with Mexico. Polk was basically an imperialist who knew that if he sent troops into disputed territory along the Texas-Mexico border, he would likely be starting a war. In fact, I'd argue he hoped it would happen. To Mexico, it was an invasion. It was completely reasonable for Mexico to attack American troops.
Well, first off, I do agree that Polk intentionally wanted to start a war, but in the treaty that Mexico signed with Texas, the disputed area was clearly part of Texas in that treaty. So not only So really, it was part of Texas that, that Mexico was in. They signed the treaty that it was in. Then they said the treaty didn't really exist, or they said it was disputed. So they kind of went back and forth on their word. But he did cause and create a war of conquest because of this. Um, Basically, he wanted California when Mexico went inside. He found ways to provoke a war with them. But to me, the worst thing he did was actually, he courted war with two nations at once. Because not only was he doing this stuff in Mexico, he was kind of pushing for war with Great Britain over what was the Oregon Territory, which is the states today of Idaho, Washington, Oregon, and a portion of Montana, but not a very big portion, as well as what's British Columbia and Vancouver Island. And they did split it in half, but he could have gotten to war with two nations at once, which is pretty reckless, especially considering that Great Britain was a major world power at the time.
As a matter of fact, which they did on April 25th, 1846. Polk couldn't have designed it any better. He went to Congress, urging them to declare war on Mexico, claiming that they, quote, shed American blood upon American soil.
Once again, by the treaty that Mexico signed with Texas, which made Texas an independent country, Polk was correct on that statement.
Congress, of course, went along with it, but it's long past due that we all admit that the Mexican-American War was a war of aggression.
It was a war of conquest. He's correct on that, but I would still say court war of two countries at the same time was worse.
A war of imperialism meant simply to expand the nation's borders.
It wasn't imperialism, though. Imperialism is when you're just creating colonies, to get like goods out of those colonies. The Mexican-American War was not imperialism at all, because they didn't just intend on keeping the extra territories colonies. Imperialism is when Britain made overseas colonies, like all over the world in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, and just never gave them the same status. Basically, imperialism is kind of, in a way, imperialism is when you're kind of taking advantage of that territory in a bad manner, just to get natural resources out of them, and it also includes mercantilism. So it wasn't really imperialism, but it was a war of aggression.
Zachary Taylor. Taylor was only in office for 16 months, but that was enough to make mistakes. Taylor's biggest mistake was raising tensions in the months leading up to the Compromise of 1850.
Tensions were already high on that compromise. He did take a strong stand to make California immediately a free state, but that was already kind of happening anyway, so he didn't raise tensions. In fact, this part here would be part of what you could put on Polk, because all this stuff happened because that new territory was brought in by the Mexican-American War. Taylor's kind of hard to pick what his worst mistake would have been, though. Maybe he gets the same one that William Henry Harrison gets. He didn't really make any big mistakes as president. He could have been a great president, but fate intervened and he just wasn't. I'd say actually going against the Compromise of 1850 might have been his biggest mistake, even though it passed anyway after he died.
Despite being a slave owner himself, Taylor rejected any compromise with the slave states to let them expand slavery out west.
Which you think Mr. Beat would think was a good thing, because he complained about the Missouri Compromise. Once again, this map is off because this is probably what the map was when Texas was admitted as a state, because Texas was not part of the United States when the Missouri Compromise happened. That's why the state doesn't look right, I would imagine. That's probably what it's taken from, because I'm pretty sure Arkansas was admitted after Missouri, and I'm thinking that Alabama and Mississippi were too. But yeah, he didn't. He wasn't willing to compromise. He wanted California to become a free state immediately, which the people in California wanted. And he said at the same time, if you look at the line going across there, there is the Missouri Compromise. And he wanted that lower portion of that encases much of Arizona and New Mexico to become a second state. They would immediately vote on it themselves, and it would have been a free state because slavery didn't exist there before the United States took it over.
As originally agreed to under the Missouri Compromise.
The Missouri Compromise did not agree to, I should have let him keep speaking, it was only for the Louisiana Territory. It didn't cover California, Nevada, Arizona, or New Mexico. It only covered territories from the Louisiana Purchase, which would have been Texas, Oklahoma, not Texas, I'm sorry, I'm wrong there. Oklahoma, the Dakotas, Kansas, Nebraska, most of Montana, part of Colorado, most of Wyoming. That's what the Missouri Compromise covered. Just territories from the Louisiana Purchase.
I appreciated Taylor taking the very clear anti-slavery stance, but in doing so, his rhetoric only further disillusioned Southern leaders and sped up the path straight toward civil war, which I guess was inevitable by this point, but still, Taylor made it worse.
I would say it was inevitable from the Kansas-Nebraska Act, although it might have taken a bit to end it. When Fillmore signed the Compromise of 1850, he was actually hailed as averting civil war, but the Kansas-Nebraska Act pretty much made it inevitable.
Millard Fillmore. After Taylor died in office, Fillmore took over and supported the Compromise of 1850. Except that he was perfectly fine with the worst part of it. He signed the Fugitive Slave Act.
So this is kind of odd, though, because he's saying going against the Compromise of 1850 was the worst thing that Taylor did. Then Fillmore becomes president. They say the worst thing he did was going in favor of the Compromise of 1850. I would probably put the Fugitive Slave Act as the worst thing he did, but he only signed it because it was part of the overall compromise. Plus, the U.S. Constitution, once again, did require that fugitive slaves be returned. And a lot of states in the North enacted laws that were called personal liberty laws, in which they wouldn't return the slaves because the first Fugitive Slave Act under Washington left it to the states. The only difference this one did was it made it enforceable by U.S. Marshals. There's a lot of other things attributed to it that aren't true. He'll probably go over some of them. They didn't force U.S. citizens in those states to go out and hunt slaves. You couldn't help aid slaves, but that would have been illegal anyway beforehand. That was already illegal if you aided a slave. Just that nothing was happening because the states weren't enforcing the federal law, which was basically the same thing as nullification on a different law that happened with the Tariff of Abomination. So he basically just took the enforcement mechanism for fugitive slave laws from this individual states because it was enforced by the state where the slave was at. So if a slave ran away to Massachusetts, it was up to Massachusetts to return the slave. He made the federal government responsible. That's all the law did. And even if it did heighten people's anti-slavery feelings, that should be seen as a good thing because turning people against slavery is actually a positive, not a negative.
Which made it so that the federal government was responsible for finding and returning escaped slaves, even if they were in a free state. Yep.
Well, that's where they escaped to was free states, though. I mean, if you're an escaped slave, you're not going to escape from South Carolina to Georgia and think you're good. You're going to try to make it up to Ohio or Pennsylvania or somewhere like that.
Free states had to cooperate. This was definitely a law that led directly to the Civil War.
No, free states had to cooperate under the previous Fugitive Slave Act. They didn't cooperate, which is why the new one was passed that made the federal government do it.
Franklin Pierce. Speaking of laws that led directly to the Civil War, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Pierce signed that law, which is easily one of the worst federal laws ever passed in American history. It opened Kansas for settlement and allowed the new settlers to determine whether it would be admitted as a slave state or a free state. Naturally, this caused a mad rush of pro-slavery and anti-slavery advocates to Kansas, and violence would often occur between the two groups. That's how the territory earned the nickname Bleeding Kansas. Pierce literally caused the prequel to the Civil War.
Totally agree. I've kind of discussed it. He's completely correct on that one.
James Buchanan. Sure, Buchanan was a corrupt dude who did some shady stuff to help only him and his friends while in office, but his biggest mistake was allowing southern states to secede. Not only did he refuse to send down federal troops to prevent them from doing so, he didn't even talk trash about southern leaders when they began to do so. He was like, oh, well, I personally don't think seceding is a good idea, but you do you, South. So Buchanan didn't just do nothing to prevent the Civil War, he did something to cause it. Isn't that something?
I agree that doing nothing when states started seceding was his biggest failure. He actually blamed the whole North and abolitionists for agitating the Southern into seceding, and his own Secretary of War basically moved supplies into the South and Southern forts so the Southerners could get them, and he actually dispersed the military down there. So his administration actually made it worse. And by him not doing nothing for several months and not holding on to most of the forts, he actually let the South grow stronger in that time frame. And he actually supported a lot of pro-slavery things, like the Lecompton Constitution and the Dred Scott decision.
Abraham Lincoln. You may already be noticing a pattern here. If you mess with the First Amendment, I got problems with you. And yes, Abraham Lincoln messed with the First Amendment. He arrested journalists and newspaper publishers who criticized his handling of the Civil War. His administration censored mail and telegraphs that undermined the war. Lincoln had people arrested singing Confederate songs, for crying out loud. I don't care if it was wartime. That's messed up, man.
I agree on that. I don't know 100% about the song singing thing. But yeah, he did go too far. I don't disagree with them suspending habeas corpus in Maryland at the time when he became president, but a lot of stuff he did later did go too far, so I agree with that.
Andrew Johnson. Yeah, I think Johnson made plenty of mistakes, but I think his biggest one was causing the Black Codes to happen. The Black Codes were laws passed by southern states designed to make the lives of recently freed slaves miserable. Essentially, slavery was now illegal after the passing of the 13th Amendment, but the Black Codes made it so African Americans still felt enslaved. After the Civil War ended, Johnson allowed pro-slavery southern legislatures to quickly take back over, and yeah, nearly all of them passed Black Code.
My biggest thing with him would be that Andrew Johnson's defiance of Reconstruction emboldened Southerners to do things like this. But the Black Codes, he didn't make those happen. He created the environment in which they could happen. So I'd say he's mostly on the right path, but I'd say basically his defiance of Reconstruction would be what I would say. And he pretty much took a pro-slavery side. He wanted to be reelected in his own right. He could only do so if you had a unified South that was on his side when he ran for re-election. So he figured if he wins all the former Confederate states, split some states in the North, he might be able to become president or remain president. That was his mistake, emboldening the South.
Ulysses Grant. Grant's biggest mistake was supporting and enforcing the Comstock laws. It all started with his signing of the Comstock Act of 1873, which made it illegal to mail stuff or receive stuff in the mail that was obscene, lewd, immoral, or indecent. It was another slap in the face of the First Amendment. After Grant signed the law, a dude named Anthony Comstock, who all these laws were named after, became the enforcer against bad stuff in the mail. He arrested an activist named Ezra Haywood after Haywood mailed one of his pamphlets which made the claim that women should have the right to control their own bodies. Comstock also arrested another dude for receiving the pamphlet in the mail.
I agree with this. The government should not legislate morality, which he still has an issue with that, but yeah, you shouldn't make laws based on your own personal morals.
Rutherford Hayes. Okay, Hayes, I get why you did this as part of the Compromise of 1877, But it still sucked that you did it. Hayes' biggest mistake was removing federal troops from the South, marking the end of Reconstruction and directly leading to a dramatic rise of white supremacist rule throughout the South. African Americans no longer had federal protection and for decades would be treated in the South as second-class citizens.
I agree on this one, but if Hayes hadn't taken the compromise, Tilden would have ended Reconstruction anyway, and Hayes actually had what's called the Battle of the Riders, where he wouldn't allow Congress to attach a law repealing the Enforcement Acts onto an appropriation bill. So I think things would have been worse had Hayes not taken the compromise. But yeah, it was his biggest mistake, because once the South didn't fulfill their end of the bargain, which is they were supposed to respect the rights of blacks, he should have done something against them more than just veto a few laws.
James Garfield. Garfield's biggest mistake was letting the media know his schedule. That's how Charles Guiteau knew Garfield was going to be at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station on July 2nd, 1881. There, Guiteau shot Garfield. Now, Garfield's other biggest mistake was trusting his doctor, Willard Bliss. Garfield was actually starting to recover before Bliss screwed things up. While trying to get his bullet out with unsterilized fingers and tools, he caused a severe infection, which ultimately led to Garfield dying from septic shock.
The tragedy here is he's right. I mean, there's really not much you can say bad about Garfield as president. But the real tragedy here is that in Europe, they were starting to use things like antiseptics and stuff like that had it been happening in the United States, Garfield probably would have lived. It's basically the United States did not have the sterilization that they had in Europe for medical equipment in people's hands. So if this would have happened, but the thing is, McKinley dies kind of the same way from gangrene from his wound too. So, but Garfield probably would have lived had he been shot 10 years later, in all honesty. Plus, they used an X-ray, but they put him on a bed with metal springs in it, so the X-ray couldn't pick up the bullet. They probably could have just left the bullet in Garfield. He probably would have lived at least out his term, and probably a little while longer, because Garfield was a young, strong, healthy man. I mean, he did lay in bed for, I think, 5 to 6 months after the assassination attempt, so, I mean, it took a while for him to die.
Chester Arthur. Arthur's biggest mistake was signing the Chinese Exclusion Act, another one of the worst laws in American history. It banned the immigration of Chinese who were coming over to do manual, unskilled labor, which the country desperately needed help with, by the way. It led to similar laws that further discriminated against Chinese Americans in the coming decade.
This one, he is correct. It's the worst thing he did, but there was an original Chinese Exclusion Act that had a 20-year ban on it. Arthur vetoed that one. They didn't override his veto. It passed the 10-year ban with an overwhelming support. And he signed that one because he knew if he vetoed it, it would just come back and be overridden his veto. So he basically just wasn't going to fight a war that he knew he couldn't win. He wasn't that type of president that would have vetoed just on principle alone. Plus, a lot of the negative stuff happening that led, the things he's saying, like these negative things, those things led to the Chinese Exclusion Act more than what he did. So, yeah, it wasn't just Arthur here, but it should be noted that Theodore Roosevelt made the Chinese Exclusion Act permanent until it was repealed by Franklin Roosevelt. So we'll see what he says for Theodore Roosevelt, because a 10-year ban is nowhere near as bad as a permanent ban. Plus, Theodore Roosevelt had a lot of other bad immigration laws as well.
Not only that, it led to what's known as the driving out era.
The driving out era was actually done by Grover Cleveland when he passed the Scott Act that would not allow Chinese immigrants to re-enter the country if they left for whatever reason. It might have been hand in hand, but it really was under Cleveland that happened.
A period in which anti-Chinese Americans assaulted and even killed Chinese Americans if they didn't get out of their communities. The bottom line is, Arthur signed the Chinese Exclusion Act because of xenophobia, an irrational fear of Chinese people.
And the problem is that it was so widespread that most people want it. A lot of these bad immigration laws are not really the fault of the guy that signed them. It's things that happened before that caused an overwhelming support of them.
Grover Cleveland. How about another crappy law? Cleveland's biggest mistake was signing the Dawes Act. The law said the president could subdivide Native American tribal communal land holdings into portions for individual heads of families to privately own, and opened up leftover plots to the general public to settle. This law single-handedly led to tribes across the country losing around 62% of their land, but its main goal was to force them to be more like Americans.
He is correct on the. That's one of the things you can say for Grover Cleveland. He was just really bad. He made the Panic of 1893 much worse. He had the Scott Act that I already said. He vetoed laws to give benefits to disabled veterans. He was really all around bad. But I guess I'll just agree on the Dawes Act. I heard 2/3 of Indian lands. And it was basically Oklahoma was all called Indian Territory. It opened up about at least half of that area to become the state of Oklahoma. I agree on the Dawes Act, but there's a lot of things that you could say. I'm going to end this video right now, right here. I'll do a part 2 later. Thank you for watching. Share, subscribe, comment, and have a great day.